The morning Nora Beckett arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, her wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the main road, and not a single soul on that busy street stopped walking. She sat up on the driver's bench for a full minute, watching the people of Caldwell move around her disabled wagon like water around a stone, their eyes sliding past her with practiced indifference. Men in dusty hats, women with market baskets. A few cowboys leaning against the post outside the saloon, watching with vague amusement but making no move to help. The wheel had folded beneath the weight of everything she owned in this world, and the wagon listed hard to the right, and still nobody stopped. Nora was 26 years old, and she had long since learned not to expect much from the world. Her late husband, Gerald Beckett, had taught her that lesson thoroughly in the 4 years they were married before a fever took him outside of Wichita. He had been the kind of man who noticed when things needed doing and then waited to see if someone else would do them first. When a fence post rotted out, he'd mention it at supper. When the porch step split, he'd tell Nora to be careful where she put her foot. It was only after he was gone, when she was left managing the small claim they'd staked together, that she understood how much of the actual work had always fallen to her. She climbed down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could manage, her dark skirt catching on the footboard and tearing a small inch at the hem. She pressed her lips together and crouched to look at the wheel. The wooden spokes had given way all at once, like they'd simply decided they were done. She didn't have another wheel. She didn't have the tools to fix this one. She had $63, a trunk of dry goods, her late mother's rocking chair lashed to the back, and a deed to a 40-acre parcel 8 miles outside of Caldwell that she'd purchased sight unseen through a land agent, because it was the only thing left she could still afford and call hers. She stood back up and looked down the street. A man was watching her from across the road. He was standing outside the livery stable, a length of rope coiled over one shoulder, and a hammer hanging easy from his right hand like he'd been born holding it. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his work shirt without straining it, and dark hair that curled a little at his collar under the brim of a plain brown hat. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from sandstone, and eyes, she would learn later, that were a particular shade of gray-green like sage after rain. He was watching her with a calm, studying expression that was entirely different from the amusement she'd seen on the faces outside the saloon. He was already moving before she could think to signal him. He crossed the road without hurrying, but there was a directness to his stride that said he'd made up his mind about something and was simply acting on it. He crouched beside the broken wheel without a word to her first, set the hammer down in the dust, and ran his hand along the collapsed spokes with the focused attention of a man who was working out a problem. "Both hub flanges are cracked," he said, without looking up. "The spokes went because the whole structure gave. You'd need a new wheel, not a repair." Nora looked down at him. "I know that." He looked up then, and there was no sting in his gaze, no condescension. He simply took the information in that she was not helpless, filed it away somewhere, and nodded. "You headed somewhere specific in town. The land office. I have a deed to record. Harlow's land office is 3 buildings down. I can get your wagon off the road and store it in the livery until you get your business done. There's a wheelwright on the south end of Main Street, fellow named Amos Prout. He'll have a replacement wheel if you tell him the axle width." He paused. "It's a standard width. He'll have it." She studied him. In her experience, when a stranger offered help this readily, there was usually a cost attached somewhere down the line. "Why?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him for half a second. He tilted his head just slightly. "Because your wagon is in the road and you can't move it alone." That was all he said. No performance of chivalry, no elaborate presentation of himself as her rescuer, just the plain logic of the situation, stated without ego. Nora felt something move in her chest that she couldn't quite name and didn't entirely trust. "I'm Nora Beckett," she said. He stood up and extended his hand. His palm was calloused and warm. "Wallace Carver. I work out of the livery." I'll get a couple of the stable hands to help shift the wagon." He did exactly that. Within 20 minutes, her wagon was tucked safely inside the livery's wide doors, her trunk and her mother's rocking chair identified and noted, and Wallace Carver was back at whatever work he'd been doing before she arrived, as though it had been nothing at all. As though it was simply the natural order of things that if someone needed help, you helped them. Nora stood on the boardwalk outside the livery and felt peculiarly unsteady, and not because of the broken wheel. She recorded her deed at the land office, spoke with the land agent, a dry man named Mr. Harlow, who told her the parcel she'd bought had a house on it, small but structurally sound, and a well that had been dug the previous year by the previous owner. The previous owner, he explained with no particular emotion, had left the territory after his wife passed. He did not elaborate on whether he meant she had died or simply left. Nora did not ask. She found Amos Pruitt's wheelwright shop on the south end of Main Street exactly where Wallace Carver had said it would be. And Pruitt did indeed have the right width wheel in stock, and it cost her $14, which she paid because she had no choice. He said he could bring it around to the livery that afternoon and fit it back onto the wagon if she wanted, for $2 more. She said yes. She returned to the livery to wait. Wallace Carver was in the back, fitting new shoes to a dappled gray horse that stood with the patience of a much older animal. He was working quietly, efficiently, talking to the horse in a low voice that Nora couldn't quite hear from where she stood in the doorway. The horse was perfectly still. She had spent enough time around horses to know that not every man could do that, keep an animal that calm simply by the steadiness of his own presence. "Your wheel is coming this afternoon," she said. "Good." He didn't stop working. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" She hesitated. "I'll get out to the property before dark if the wheel is fitted by 4. "It'll be fitted by 3. He set the horse's hoof down and straightened, pressing one hand briefly to his lower back. "The road out to the Dawson parcels, which is what's on your deed if I had to guess from the direction Harlow usually sells. It's passable in daylight, but there are 2 creek crossings. After dark you'd be guessing at the depth." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know what's on my deed?" "I don't. I'm guessing from the section of land the old owner was selling through Harlow's office. It was Dawson's East 40. "Was it?" She didn't answer right away. "I'm not prying," he said simply. "I'm telling you the road is better in daylight, that's all." "It is the Dawson parcel," she said. He nodded. "Then leave by 3:30 and you'll be fine. The second creek crossing is the one to watch. Stay to the left of center. There's a sandbar on the right that looks firm, but it isn't." She absorbed this. She wondered how many times he'd ridden that road. She wondered quite a few things about Wallace Carver, and pushed them all aside because she had a property to get to and a life to start over, and she had not come to Caldwell looking for anything beyond a piece of ground she could call her own. "Thank you, Mr. Carver," she said. "Wallace," he said, and went back to the horse. The wheel was fitted at 5 minutes past 3. Nora had her wagon loaded by 3:20, her mother's rocking chair secure on the back again, and she drove out of Caldwell into the golden late afternoon, following the directions Wallace Carver had written on a piece of paper in a clear, practical hand. Left at the fork past the mill. 2 miles on the straight road. First creek right of center. Second creek left of center. House is set back from the road. You'll see the cottonwood first. She saw the cottonwood first. The house was indeed small. 2 rooms, a sleeping loft that could be accessed by a steep ladder, a kitchen area that shared space with everything else. But the walls were solid, the roof was tight when she checked it by pressing on the ceiling boards, and the well, when she lowered the bucket, came back with clear water. There was a barn in the back that needed some work but was essentially standing. There was 40 acres of mixed grassland and scrub that she could not yet fully imagine what to do with, but she had the whole of the rest of her life to figure that out. She sat in her mother's rocking chair on the small porch as the sun went down over the Kansas plains, and she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was in exactly the right place. She was back in Caldwell 3 days later for supplies. She needed flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and a pry bar to deal with a section of fence rail that had fallen across the south side of her property. She was in Dalton's general store with her list when she noticed, from the window, that her horse was standing oddly at the post outside. She stepped out and saw that the left front lead rope had worked itself into a tight knot around the hitching rail in a way that was putting pressure on the horse's bridle. The horse was uncomfortable but calm. She began working at the knot with her fingers. A moment later, Wallace Carver was standing beside her. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply looked at the knot, assessed it in the same way he'd assessed the wagon wheel, reached into his vest pocket, and produced a small folding knife. He sliced the tension from the binding loop so delicately that the rope came free without startling the horse, and then he stepped back and the whole thing was done. Nora looked at him. "You have the instinct of a man who has fixed things his whole life," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. "My father was a carpenter," he said. "He said there wasn't a problem in the world that wasn't mostly just a thing waiting to be put right." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "I need a pry bar. Do you know where I'd find one in this town that won't cost me the rest of my week's budget?" He thought for a moment. "Come around to the livery after you finish your list. I have 2 in the tool room that I don't use. You can borrow one as long as you need it." She opened her mouth to say that she couldn't impose, and then she stopped herself, because she'd spent 4 years being married to a man who never once offered anything without being asked, and sometimes not even then, and she was tired of turning down help that was genuinely, simply offered. "Thank you," she said. "I will." She finished her list and went around to the livery, and Wallace Carver was waiting with a solid iron pry bar that was the right weight for a person of her height and build, which she noticed because it was not the largest one he had. He'd thought about what would be practical for her specifically. She did not say anything about that, but she did think about it for the rest of the drive home. The fence rail gave way on the third try with the pry bar, and she dragged it aside and stacked it near the barn, and felt the deep satisfaction of a thing done. The sun was low. The plain stretched out in every direction in shades of amber and rust, and the particular dusty purple that came right before full dark in Kansas. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass to the west. She stood with the pry bar in her hands and thought about Wallace Carver's eyes. She put that thought back where it came from and went inside to make supper. Over the next 3 weeks she came into Caldwell 6 more times. Supply runs, a visit to the post office where she was expecting a letter from her sister Cora back in Missouri, a trip to the bank to speak about possible financing for a small herd of cattle, which the bank manager, a prim man named Mr. Ferris, had told her with barely concealed skepticism was an unusual ambition for a widow woman managing her land alone. She had thanked him for his time and walked out without raising her voice, which she considered something of an accomplishment. Each time she came into town, she saw Wallace Carver at least once. The territory was not large and Caldwell was a working town, and the livery was on the main road, so there was nothing remarkable about the frequency of their encounters. What was more difficult to account for was the way she began to notice things about him between encounters. She noticed that when she came in to return the pry bar, he put a new handle on it without mentioning it. The original handle had had a hairline crack she hadn't said anything about, but she'd noticed it, and apparently so had he. When she asked him about it, he simply said the old handle would have split on her eventually, so he'd replaced it. She noticed that when her horse threw a shoe on the road outside of town one afternoon and she walked him in, Wallace had the shoe replaced within the hour, and when she reached for her coin purse he shook his head and said the shoe had been improperly fit the first time, and it was not her fault, and he wouldn't charge for correcting someone else's poor work. She noticed that when she mentioned, in passing, that the rope pulley on her well had frayed and was getting difficult to use, he turned up at her property 2 days later on his day off with a new pulley and the hardware to mount it, and had the whole thing done in 40 minutes, and then sat on her porch and drank the coffee, she offered him without making any particular production out of having done a kindness. It was that last thing, perhaps, that undid her more than any of the others. It was the absence of production. Gerald had done the occasional repair, but always with a commentary on the effort involved, an accounting of his time and skill, as if the help came with a ledger attached. She had come to expect that from men, that the generosity would always be inflected with some awareness of itself, some need to be recognized and thanked in a way that confirmed the man's place in the transaction. Wallace Carver simply did the thing and then sat down and drank his coffee and asked her how the south pasture was coming along, because she'd mentioned last week that she was thinking of clearing it for a kitchen garden. She found herself telling him. She found herself telling him quite a lot of things, and he listened the same way he fixed things, with full attention and no wasted motion, asking a question here or there that showed he'd heard everything she'd said and was thinking about it. "You're going to run cattle," he said on that afternoon on her porch. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "The bank won't help me yet, but I have enough saved for 4 or 5 head to start. If I build up the herd carefully over 2 seasons, I can be running 20 by the end of next year." He nodded. "You'll want to fence the north pasture first. The land drops away to the creek past the ridge, and a young steer will follow a cow straight into trouble over there." She looked at him. "You know this land. I rode out this way some before you bought it. The old owner, Bill Dawson, I knew him some. He was a decent man." He paused. "He was grieving when he left. His wife Ellen, she died in February. It was hard on him." "I'm sorry," Nora said. And then, because something in the way he spoke about grief seemed personal, she said carefully, "Have you lost someone?" He was quiet for a moment. The meadowlark was at it again in the south pasture, the exact same bird or one that sounded like it. "My wife," he said, 3 years ago. Fever, same as half the people who died that year. Her name was Catherine." He said it quietly, without the brittle quality that meant a wound still fully open. It was the voice of a man who had done the work of grief and come through it, still carrying it but not crushed by it. "She was a good woman. She deserved more years than she got." Nora held her coffee cup with both hands and thought about Gerald and what she would say about him if asked. That he had been a man of his time, that he had not been cruel. That there had been moments of warmth. That she had been more relieved than she'd admitted to anyone, including herself, when she was finally alone and making her own decisions. She did not say any of that. She said, "I'm sorry about Catherine." "Thank you," he said, and he meant it, and they sat in a companionable silence for a while as the light faded and the Kansas evening came on cool and clean. He rode back into town before full dark, and she stood on her porch and watched him go and felt the strange, warm weight of something she hadn't felt in a long while, that sense of being seen by someone without any agenda attached to the seeing. She wrote a letter to her sister Cora that night by lamplight. She told Cora about the property, about the well, about the plans for the cattle. She told her about Caldwell, about the land office and the general store and the wheelwright named Amos Prout. She mentioned at the end, almost as an afterthought, that there was a man at the livery who had helped her several times without being asked, and she had not once known what to do with that. She had never once encountered that before, she wrote, a man who simply saw what needed doing and did it without needing to be thanked in any particular way. She did not know what to make of him, she wrote. He was straightforward and steady, and he had gray-green eyes, and he had loved his wife truly. She could tell, and she trusted that about a man. She sealed the letter and set it out to go in the Morning Post and went to bed and lay awake for a while in the dark, listening to the sounds of the Kansas night, the crickets and the distant coyotes and the wind in the cottonwood outside her window. She did not let herself think about Wallace Carver. She thought about him anyway. In June, a cattle drive came through Caldwell. It was a mixed herd of 800 longhorns pushed up from Texas by a crew of 15 cowboys, and the town swelled with the noise and smell and chaos that always accompanied a drive's arrival. The cowboys were mostly young and mostly loud, and the saloons were full every night, and there were 3 different fistfights in the street over the course of a week that Nora heard about second-hand from the storekeeper's wife, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Dalton, who had strong opinions about cowboys and shared them freely. Nora was in town for supplies on the second day of the drive's arrival, and the main street was thicker with activity than usual, horses and cattle and men, and the noise of commerce and indulgence. She was loading her wagon outside Dalton's when she heard a commotion further down the street. One of the longhorns had broken away from the holding pen behind the stockyards and was now moving at a fast trot up the main road, scattering people onto the boardwalks. It was not a charging animal, not panicked exactly, but a 1,200-pound steer moving through a street full of people was its own kind of emergency regardless of temperament. A few of the drive's cowboys were running after it, one of them trying to get a rope up, but they were on foot and the steer was not. Wallace Carver appeared from the direction of the livery on horseback, a calm, fast-moving bay horse that he sat easily, his rope already out. He didn't rush. That was the thing Nora noticed even with her heart in her throat for the safety of the people in the street. He didn't rush. He read the steer's direction, cut ahead at an angle, and dropped the loop around its neck with a single throw that looked almost casual. The horse backed up the tension of the rope without being told, and the steer slowed and then stopped, and the whole episode was over in about 90 seconds. One of the trail cowboys jogged up to take the steer back to the pen. Wallace handed over the rope, exchanged a few words with the man, and then turned and rode back toward the livery without any particular fanfare. He saw Nora on the boardwalk as he passed, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, Mrs. Beckett," he said. "That was remarkably calm," she said. "Steer was more lost than angry," he said. "You just had to show him the way back." He rode on. Nora stood on the boardwalk and watched him, and Mrs. Dalton appeared at her elbow. "That's Wallace Carver," Mrs. Dalton said, as if Nora might not know. "He's been here 4 years. He manages the livery, but he owns a 1/4 share of it, and the other 3/4 share owner, old Pete Hannigan, he's mostly retired these days and lets Wallace run the whole operation. He's a good man, a steady man." She paused meaningfully. "He's been alone since his wife passed." "I know who he is," Nora said. "Of course you do," Mrs. Dalton said pleasantly, and went back inside her store. The following week a man came to Nora's property. His name was Garrett Slade, and he was the kind of man that the territory produced in numbers, a man who had come west with ambitions that outran his ethics. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad through the middle, with a salesman's smile that stopped well short of his eyes. He rode up to her property on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the flat white of coming heat, and told her that he represented a buyer interested in her 40 acres. "I'm not selling," she said from her porch. She had not invited him to come closer. "Now, Mrs. Beckett, you haven't heard the offer yet. My client is prepared to be generous for a rapid transaction." "I said I'm not selling, Mr. Slade." He dismounted anyway and tied his horse to her porch post, which she had not invited him to do, and came up to the bottom step with his hat in his hand and his smile still operating. "This is difficult land for a woman alone," he said. "The north pasture floods in a wet year. The access to Caldwell isn't easy in winter. My client is doing you a service by offering to relieve you of a difficult situation." Nora looked at him for a long, even moment. She had a loaded rifle inside the door, and she was entirely capable of using it, but she was also 26 years old in 1882 and a widow woman without a neighbor within 3 miles, and the arithmetic of the situation was uncomfortable. "You need to get back on your horse," she said, "and leave my property." Something shifted in Slade's expression, the salesman quality dropping for a moment into something colder. "I'll come back," he said, "when you've had time to think." He left. She watched him ride out, and she stood on her porch for a while after he was out of sight and felt the vulnerability of her situation, the 40 acres and the small house and the good well and the 40 acres that apparently someone else wanted enough to send a man like Garrett Slade out to persuade her. She went to Caldwell the next day. She did not go specifically to see Wallace Carver. She went to speak with the land office again and establish the record of her deed in more detail, and to speak with the county sheriff about Slade's visit, which she felt warranted documentation even if there had been no direct threat. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Beaumont who had the manner of a man who had been dealing with difficult situations for a long time and was no longer particularly alarmed by any of them, listened to her account and said he'd look into Slade's business and who he was representing. She came by the livery afterward because she needed a stone of oats for her horse and the livery sold grain. Wallace was out front, mending a section of the paddock fence. He had a bucket of nails and a hammer, and he was working steadily along the railing, replacing the boards that had warped over the winter. She pulled her wagon up and he came over and she told him about the oats and he went to get them. And then he came back and set the sack in her wagon and she told him about Garrett Slade. She told him in the same tone she'd told the sheriff, factual and clear, because the story needed to be told clearly and she was not a woman who dramatized, but also because she found, inconveniently, that she wanted Wallace Carver to know about it. He listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened slightly when she described the moment Slade had tied his horse to her post without permission, and again when she recounted the comment about difficult land for a woman alone. But he didn't say anything rash about it. He thought for a moment. Slade is known around here, he said. He works for a man named Theodore Price. Price has been buying up land east of town over the past 2 years. He's got about 300 acres now and he's been looking to extend toward the creek corridor because he wants the water rights. My well, Nora said, and the creek access on your south boundary. It's the best natural water in that section. He paused. He's not a man who gives up quickly. Neither am I, Nora said. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was different from the practical steadiness he usually wore. There was something warmer there, a kind of recognition, like something he'd suspected about her had just been confirmed. I know that, he said, and then carefully, if Slade comes back, would you want someone to know about it beforehand? I ride out that road some, checking on a few properties I look in on for people. I could extend the route to pass by your place. She looked at him for a moment. That would take you out of your way. Not by much. She thought of Slade's cold eyes behind his salesman's smile. She thought of her loaded rifle inside the door and the fact that she was alone out there and that mattered. I would appreciate that, she said. He nodded and that was that, and she drove home. And 2 days later she heard a horse in the late afternoon and looked out her window and saw Wallace Carver riding past on the road below her property. Not stopping, just passing through in a way that could have been entirely accidental and wasn't. She stood at her window and watched him ride past, and felt the warmth in her chest that she'd been trying to name for weeks settle into something she could finally identify. She was falling in love with him. She set that realization on a shelf in her mind and looked at it for a while, and then went back to her kitchen work. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. She was not even sure it was wise, falling in love in the middle of trying to establish a life in unfamiliar territory with an unpleasant land buyer circling her property like a vulture. She was not sure of very much at all, but she was sure of Wallace Carver. She was sure of the steadiness of him, the way he saw things clearly and responded to what was actually there rather than what he thought ought to be there. She was sure that he had been honest with her about his grief, and about her road, and about Theodore Price's intentions. She was sure that his hands on her horse's lead rope had been gentle and sure, and that his eyes, when they rested on her, had the quality of a man who was paying attention to something he valued. She was sure of him. That was the unsettling thing. July came in hot and relentless, the way Kansas summers did, the sky a hard blue sheet and the grass going the color of straw. Nora's kitchen garden was doing well with daily watering from the new pulley well. She had purchased 4 head of cattle, 3 heifers and a young bull, from a rancher north of town named Dutch Keller who'd spoken to her directly, and fairly without any of the condescension she'd encountered at the bank. The cattle were doing well on the north pasture which she had, following Wallace Carver's advice, fenced properly before she brought them in. Garrett Slade came back in July. He came back on a Thursday afternoon with 2 other men she didn't recognize, and this time he didn't bother with the smile for long. She was in the garden when she heard them coming. She walked around to the front of the house and stood on the porch and watched them ride up, 3 of them, and her stomach went tight but her face went still. "Mrs. Beckett," Slade said, "you've had time to consider." "My answer hasn't changed," she said. "That's unfortunate." His eyes moved over her property with a proprietary quality that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Price is a patient man, but not infinitely so. The offer is still generous." "I'm not selling," she said for the 3rd time. "Not to Mr. Price or anyone else. This is my land and I intend to keep it. I'd ask you to leave now." One of the men with Slade, a lean, angular man with hard eyes, shifted his horse forward. "There's ways to make a piece of land less desirable," he said. It was not a veiled threat. It was a direct one. Nora felt the cold clarity of real danger and fought to keep it off her face. Then she heard hoofbeats on the road. Wallace Carver came up the track to her property at a steady trot, unhurried but purposeful, and pulled his horse up a few feet from where Slade and his men were standing. He looked at the 3 men with an expression that contained no anger, which was somehow more effective than anger would have been. "Slade," he said, Slade's jaw tight. "Carver." "I passed you on the road," Wallace said with perfect calm. "Thought I'd ride in and say hello to Mrs. Beckett." He looked at Slade with steady gray-green eyes. "I'll tell you what I told you last time. Price sent someone out to the Hendricks place before the Hendricks sold. This is private property, and the lady has made her position clear. There's nothing here worth the sheriff's interest unless someone gives him a reason." Slade looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Nora. He looked at his 2 men and seemed to make a calculation that produced the answer that today was not the day. "We'll be going," he said, and turned his horse. They rode out and the dust settled back onto the road, and Nora stood on her porch and let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 5 full minutes. Wallace dismounted and tied his horse to the post, which she noticed he'd asked about the first time he came to the property, where it was all right to tie, and she'd told him the post and he'd remembered. "Are you all right?" he asked. Yes, she thought about it. The man with the hard eyes said there were ways to make a piece of land less desirable. That's an old tactic. Water spoiled, fences cut, cattle shifted. It's harassment, not damage they can afford to keep up without risking real legal trouble. His voice was level. "But it's worth documenting every visit. Have you been keeping a written record?" "I started one after the first visit." He nodded with that characteristic quality of a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "Good. Keep it up. I'll speak to Beaumont tomorrow about this visit specifically." The comment from the second man was a clear threat, and it should be on record. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she was tired of standing in the formal register of gratitude and not saying the other things, she said, "You didn't happen to be passing. You came out specifically." He met her eyes. He didn't try to maintain the fiction of coincidence. "I had a feeling Slade might be circling back around," he said. "You came out to make sure I was all right." "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him standing in the July heat with his hat in his hand and the dust from Slade's departure still settling on the road, and she made a decision. "Come inside and have some water," she said. "It's too hot to stand out here." He followed her inside. She poured water from the clay pitcher and they sat at her kitchen table, which was small and the chairs were close together, and she told him about her sister Cora and about Missouri and about Gerald. In the honest version, she hadn't told anyone since coming to Caldwell. Not the softened version. The real one, that Gerald had been a man who waited, that she had spent 4 years waiting alongside him, and it had cost her something she was only now beginning to reclaim. He listened. He didn't offer a judgment of Gerald, and he didn't offer reassurance. He listened. Then he said, "Catherine was patient with me in ways I didn't always deserve. I was a different man at 22 than I became later. She was generous about the growing." "How old are you now?" Nora asked. 31, he said. She was 26. She thought about that, about the 5 years between them, about the different kinds of growing they'd each done in the space of those years. They'd both arrived at a certain kind of knowledge that only came from loss and rebuilding. She thought they might be more similar in the important ways than the arithmetic of their ages suggested. "I think you should know something," she said, and then stopped. He waited. "I think you should know," she said again, more carefully, "that I have been noticing you for a while now. And I am not a woman who says things without meaning them, so I want to be clear that I am telling you something real, and I am not going to pretend I said it if it makes you uncomfortable." Wallace Carver was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she felt the blood rise in her face. Then he said, "I have been noticing you too, Mrs. Beckett." "Nora," she said. "Nora," he said. She felt the warmth of her own name in his voice settle into her chest like something long waited for. They sat at the small kitchen table for another hour, talking in a way that was entirely different from all their previous conversations, still honest and direct, but carrying a new current beneath it, the awareness of what had just been acknowledged sitting between them like a lamp that had been lit. He told her about his family in Ohio, his father the carpenter, his mother who had been a school teacher and had taught him to read properly and had opinions about books. He told her about how he'd come west at 23 with the specific intention of finding land and building something, and how that plan had shifted when he'd met Catherine, who had been from Caldwell originally, and how staying had become easy because it was where she was. And after she was gone, he stayed because there was nothing pulling him away and the work was good and the land suited him. She told him about coming west with Gerald, about the claim outside Wichita, about learning to drive a wagon and shoot a rifle and manage a kitchen garden all at the same time. She told him that she had purchased this land because she needed something of her own, something that couldn't be taken from her by circumstance or someone else's passivity, and that it had been the right decision even though it was hard. It was the right decision, he agreed. When he left, the evening was coming on and the air had cooled to something bearable, and the meadowlark was singing in the south pasture again. He mounted his horse at the post and looked back at her on the porch. "I'll speak to Beaumont tomorrow," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Nora," he said, just her name, testing the new permission of it. "Wallace," she said back, and was pleased by the way his expression moved at the sound of it. He rode out and she watched him go, and she went inside and sat in her mother's rocking chair and rocked gently for a while with her hands in her lap, feeling the complicated and tender texture of hope. In the weeks that followed, things changed between them in the way that things change when an acknowledgement has been made, and both parties are being careful with it, not rushing, not retreating, but moving forward in small, deliberate increments like people who have both been hurt before and understand the value of not breaking what is fragile. He came to her property on Sunday afternoons when it was his day away from the livery. He helped her with the things that needed helping with, the fence post that had heaved in the summer heat, the barn door hinge that had rusted nearly through, the section of the well surround that was beginning to erode. But they also simply talked, sitting on the porch in the evening or walking the perimeter of the property in the long summer light, talking about the cattle and the coming season and books they had both read and the particular quality of the Kansas sky, and the things that had made them who they were. He held her hand for the first time in August, on an evening when they were walking the south fence line, and she lost her footing on the uneven ground, and he caught her arm and then simply kept hold of her hand as they walked on, as naturally as breathing, and she let him. Theodore Price made one more approach in August, through a lawyer this time rather than through Slade. The lawyer sent a letter offering what was admittedly a significant sum for the property. Nora wrote back herself, in clear language, that the property was not for sale and that any further approaches would be forwarded directly to the county sheriff. She showed the letter to Wallace before she sent it, and he read it and said, "That's clear enough." She sent it. They heard nothing more from Price after that. Sheriff Beaumont had, it turned out, been building a file on Theodore Price's land acquisition methods for some months. Garrett Slade was asked to leave the territory in September in connection with a separate matter involving a property dispute in the next county, and the lean, angular man who had made the veiled threat on Nora's porch was identified as having a warrant out for him in Nebraska, and that was the last of the particular pressure on her land. What was left after that was simply life. Her herd grew to 7 head by the end of summer. She broke her own ground for winter wheat in September, using a borrowed plow from Dutch Keller and her own 2 hands, and the horse that had thrown a shoe in front of the livery all those months ago. She canned the last of the kitchen garden in October, lining the shelves of her root cellar with jars of tomatoes and beans, and the apple butter she'd made from the 2 small trees at the back of the property that she'd discovered in full fruit one morning, and taken as a personal gift from the land. She and Wallace went to the harvest social in Caldwell in October, and it was the first time people saw them arrive together, and she noticed Mrs. Dalton's knowing and satisfied expression from across the room, and she found she didn't mind it. They danced twice, slowly, the second time with his hand at the small of her back and her hand on his shoulder, and she could feel the steadiness of him through her palm, and it was exactly what she'd thought it would feel like. There was a fiddler and a caller, and the whole of Caldwell's population crammed into the Grange Hall, and she was warm and laughing at something he'd said, and when she looked up at him, she found he was watching her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, just Wallace Carver looking at Nora Beckett without any layer between the feeling and his face. "What?" She said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell." She felt those words enter her chest and settle somewhere permanent. "I am too," she said. "The winter came in sharp and early that year, the way Kansas winters did, and the plains went white, and the cold was a serious and uncompromising cold. Nora managed her property through it steadily, the cattle brought in close to the barn, the wood stacked high, the root cellar well provisioned. Wallace rode out most Sundays regardless of the weather, or she drove into town when the road was passable, and on the Sundays when the weather was too severe for either, she found that the missing of him was a specific ache that she had not felt about anyone or anything in a long time. She told Cora about him in letters. She told Cora about the gray-green eyes and the carpenter father and the way he listened, and she told Cora about Slade and about the property being secure now. And she told Cora that she thought she was in love with Wallace Carver the way she had not been in love with Gerald, in the way that she had wondered as a girl whether it was actually possible to feel, the way that made ordinary days feel like something worth describing in letters. Cora wrote back in December and said that she was coming to visit in the spring, and that she had always known Nora would make something extraordinary out of her own life if she was given the room to do it. Nora read that letter twice and then folded it and pressed it flat with her palm on the kitchen table and thought about room, about how much of her life had felt like she was trying to grow in a space too small for her, and about how this 40 acres and this life she was making felt, for the first time, like a space that was exactly the right size. Christmas came quietly. She went into Caldwell for the Christmas gathering at the church, and afterward Wallace walked with her through the cold night street to her wagon, and they stood in the clean winter air that smelled of wood smoke and cold, and the pine boughs that had been hung on every post and door along the main road. Their breath showed in the lamplight. "I have something for you," he said, and reached into his coat pocket and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper, carefully tied with a bit of red ribbon that she suspected Mrs. Dalton had provided. Inside was a small book, a volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson, which she had mentioned once in passing that she had loved as a girl and never had a copy of her own. She stood in the street and held it in both hands and felt the specific weight of it, the weight of someone who had listened and remembered. She looked up at him in the lamplight. "Wallace," she said, "I noticed you were borrowing Mrs. Dalton's copy," he said, and then she kissed him, which she had decided to do sometime in the previous 5 minutes and had simply been waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was that sentence, a man who noticed she was borrowing a book and went and found her a copy of her own. He was very still for the first second, and then he was not still at all, and his hands came up to hold her face with the same gentleness and sureness he brought to everything, and the cold Kansas night was entirely irrelevant. They stood there in the lamplight of Caldwell's Main Street on Christmas night, and when they parted, they were both smiling in a way that had no self-consciousness in it at all. "Merry Christmas, Nora," he said. "Merry Christmas, Wallace," she said. She drove home in the dark with the poetry book on the seat beside her and her heart so full she thought it might embarrass her, and she thought that her father would have liked Wallace Carver very much, and that her mother would have said, finally, in the tone she used when things arrived exactly as they should after making everyone wait too long. Spring came back to the Kansas plains the way it always did after a hard winter, with a kind of insistence, the green pushing up through the brown with no interest in anyone's opinion. Nora's winter wheat came up in March, thin at first and then thickening, and she stood at the edge of her north field and looked at the 10 acres she'd planted and felt the particular pride of a thing grown from her own work. Cora arrived in April on the stage from Wichita, a small bright woman with dark hair like Nora's and a quick manner, and an immediate, frank assessment of everything she encountered. She was 28 and had been widowed herself 2 years earlier and had come west, she said, with the intention of seeing what her sister had built. She saw the property and said, "Nora, this is genuinely lovely." She saw the cattle and said, "You always did have a way with large animals." She met Wallace Carver on the second day of her visit when he came by on a Sunday afternoon, and she watched him for approximately 20 minutes and then cornered Nora in the kitchen while Wallace was outside looking at the fence post he'd noticed was working loose again. "He is already fixing a fence post you haven't asked him to fix," Cora said. "I know," Nora said, without any fanfare about it. "I know, Nora," Cora said with great significance. "I know," Nora said for the third time, and Cora laughed and hugged her. Cora stayed 2 weeks. By the end of the first week she had decided she liked Caldwell and she liked Kansas, and she liked the particular quality of the light in the evenings and the meadowlark that lived in the south pasture. By the end of the second week she had spoken with the schoolteacher in Caldwell about the possibility of a second classroom position, as the school was growing and the single teacher was overwhelmed. When she left she said to Nora, "I may be back in the fall." "I'll make room," Nora said. "That man loves you," Cora said at the stage, with the directness of someone who had no time for subtlety on this point. "I know," Nora said. "Have you told him that you love him?" Nora looked at her sister. "I'm going to." "Good," Cora said and got on the stage. Wallace came to find her that evening, not knowing that Cora had left that day, just coming by as he sometimes did on evenings when the day was long and the light was good, and found her sitting on the porch looking at the south pasture. He sat down in the other chair. "She's gone?" he asked. "This afternoon." Nora paused. "She might come back in the fall. There's a teaching position." "Good," he said. "She's a good person." "She is." Nora looked at the south pasture, at the long gold light lying across the grass. "She told me you love me." Silence, a particular attentive silence. "She's perceptive," he said. "Is she right?" He turned to look at her and his expression was entirely open, every careful layer down, just the man and the feeling and no distance between them. "Yes," he said, "she's right." Nora felt the word enter her the way the warmth of a fire enters a cold room all at once and completely. "I love you too," she said, in case that wasn't clear. The corner of his mouth moved. "I was beginning to hope," he said. "You fixed my well pulley," she said, "on your day off, without being asked." "It needed fixing," he said. "I had never once encountered that before," she said. "A man who saw what needed doing and simply did it, without keeping a ledger." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those gray-green eyes that were soft in the evening light. "My father said the best way to show someone you love them is to pay attention to what they need and then meet it, without waiting to be asked." "Your father was a wise man," she said. "He was," he agreed. They sat together in the late light of the Kansas evening, and the meadowlark sang its last song before dark, and the cattle moved slowly in the north pasture, and the cottonwood beside the house moved in the early summer breeze. He asked her to marry him in May. He did not do it with elaborate ceremony, though he had clearly thought about it carefully. He came to her on a Sunday morning, and they had walked out to the edge of the south pasture where the ground dropped slightly toward the creek, and the view opened out across 3 miles of rolling Kansas land, the kind of view that made you understand why people had come here, why they had broken themselves on the difficulty of this place and still kept coming. He stood beside her with his hat in his hands and said, "I would like to marry you, Nora. If you'll have me. I would like to build something with you. I think what we could build together is better than what either of us can do alone. And I don't mean that practically, though it's true practically too. I mean it in the way that matters more than that." She looked at him in the morning light, at the man he was, steady and honest and gentle and strong, the man who fixed things without being asked, who listened without keeping a ledger, who had loved his wife truly and mourned her honestly and grown beyond the grief into something more. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you, Wallace Carver." He smiled then, the full smile she'd seen only a handful of times, the one that changed his whole face and showed the person underneath the practical steadiness. He put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood at the edge of the south pasture with the Kansas morning all around them, and the meadowlark going in the grass somewhere nearby. They were married in July of 1883 at the Caldwell church, a small ceremony with the people who mattered, Mrs. Dalton, who wept productively throughout, Dutch Keller and his wife, who had become friends over the cattle dealings, Sheriff Beaumont, who shook Wallace's hand and told Nora she'd picked a good one, and Cora, who had indeed returned in the fall and taken the teaching position, and was now living in a rented room above the Dalton store, and who stood beside Nora at the altar and pressed her hand once, hard, in the moment before the ceremony began. Nora wore a dress of blue wool that she had made herself over the winter from a bolt of cloth she'd ordered from the dry goods catalog. It was not a traditional white gown, but it was exactly what she wanted, simple and well-made and entirely hers. Wallace wore his good shirt and a jacket that fit him properly, and he stood at the front of the church with his hands loose at his sides, not nervous exactly, just waiting. And when she came down the aisle, he looked at her with the full attention he brought to everything important, and she felt it land on her like sunlight. The minister read the words, and they said the words, and Wallace's hand around hers was warm and sure, and when the minister said he could kiss the bride, Wallace cupped her face in both hands and kissed her as if she were the most important thing in the world, which she was, and she kissed him back with everything she had. The reception was held at the Grange Hall, the same hall where they had danced at the harvest social the previous fall, and there was the same fiddler and the same caller and the whole of Caldwell filling the room, because a wedding in a small territory town was an occasion for everyone. They danced every dance, and Wallace was a better dancer than she'd known, and he laughed at himself when he missed a step, which she found she loved about him, the willingness to be wrong about himself without it costing him anything. They drove home together that evening to the property that was now theirs together, the 40 acres and the small house and the good well and the cottonwood and the meadowlark. He had been at the house the day before, she discovered, and had fixed 3 things without mentioning it: the kitchen shelf bracket that had been slightly loose for a month, the front door latch that had been stiff in cold weather, the cracked board on the porch step that she'd been meaning to address and hadn't. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the tight bracket and felt tears come up unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from a kind of gratitude so profound it had nowhere else to go. This was the man he was. This was who she had married. A man who noticed and responded and did not need to be thanked in any particular way, because the doing was enough for him. He turned around and he was standing in the doorway watching her, and he saw her eyes. "Nora," he said. "The bracket," she said, and gestured at it and laughed at herself a little. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands and looked at her. "What is it?" "You fixed it," she said. You fixed the bracket and the door and the porch step and you didn't say a word about it." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "They needed fixing. That's what you always say. It's always true." She pressed her palm to his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating. "I never knew someone could be like you," she said. "I genuinely did not know it was possible. I spent years thinking that a man who simply saw what needed doing and did it without needing a reward for it was something from a novel, not a real thing." He covered her hand with his. "It's not complicated," he said quietly. "You love someone. You take care of what's theirs. You pay attention." He paused. "You take care of what's ours now." The word ours settled into the room between them like something that had always belonged there. They built a life on that 40 acres with the purposeful deliberateness of two people who had both been given a second chance and understood the value of not wasting it. Wallace took a partner's stake in a small cattle operation with Dutch Keller and managed that alongside the livery work, which he continued until old Pete Hannigan died in the fall of 1883 and left his three-quarter share of the livery to Wallace outright. A fact that arrived in a letter from Hannigan's lawyer and left Wallace sitting at the kitchen table for a full evening, in a kind of quiet gratitude that Nora recognized, because she'd felt it herself when the deed to this land had first been in her hands. They built an addition on the house in the spring of 1884, 2 extra rooms, Wallace doing the framing himself and Nora working beside him, because she had decided she was going to learn to frame a wall, and he was an entirely patient teacher. The addition gave them a proper bedroom separate from the main living area and a second room that became, by the end of the year, a nursery. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the same room where Nora had first sat with her mother's rocking chair and looked out at the cottonwood. He was a robust and opinionated baby with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and they named him Thomas James Carver, Thomas for Wallace's father and James for Nora's. Wallace held him in the first hour of his life with the same steady hands that fixed things and kept horses calm, and held Nora's face when he kissed her, and he looked at his son with an expression that she had never seen on him before, beyond love, beyond pride, something more fundamental than either, the expression of a man discovering a fact about himself he had not previously known. Cora came over the same day despite the cold and held Thomas and cried, which she claimed was not crying, but was something she described as a strong emotional response to his exceptional handsomeness. Nora laughed until she was sore, which was ill-advised given the circumstances, but it was impossible not to. Thomas grew. The cattle herd grew. Nora's wheat field expanded to 20 acres in the second year, and she was doing business with 2 buyers in Wichita. Wallace took on a full-time hand at the livery, a young man of 19 named Sam Greer, who had come to Caldwell from the east with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to learn. And Wallace taught him the work the same way his father had taught him, patiently and completely, and Sam stayed and became good at it. In the spring of 1886, Cora married a man named Robert Hale, the Caldwell School Board chairman who was a widower with 2 grown daughters, a quiet and thoughtful man of 42 who had been in love with Cora for approximately 6 months before she decided to acknowledge it. Nora stood beside her sister at the same Caldwell church and pressed her hand once, hard, in the moment before the ceremony, and Cora laughed and the minister began the words. The second child, a girl they named Ellen in honor of Bill Dawson's wife who had loved this land before them, arrived in 1886 as well, in the summer this time, a warm and easy birth that left Nora exhausted in a satisfied rather than a frightened way. Ellen had her mother's disposition and her father's hands, and from the time she was old enough to follow Wallace around the property she did, watching with concentrated attention while he worked, handing him nails when he asked for them and sometimes when he didn't. Thomas was 2 when Ellen was born and was already the kind of child who needed to know how everything worked, taking apart and putting together every object in the house that could be taken apart, And Wallace taught him without impatience, showing him the how and the why of things. The same principle for every lesson. You look at what's needed and you respond to that. In the evening, when the children were in their beds and the property was quiet, they sat together on the porch in the chairs that were now the right shape, worn into the right places by 4 years of sitting in them together, and they watched the Kansas night come down. "Do you remember telling me about my road?" Nora said one evening. "The first week I was here, you told me to stay left of center at the second crossing." "You remembered that," he said. "I remember everything you've ever told me," she said. "I think I was paying attention from the first day." He reached across and took her hand, the same way he'd taken it on the south fence line 4 years ago, naturally and without ceremony. "I remember your wagon wheel," he said. "I remember thinking that you were going to handle it whether anyone helped you or not." "I would have," she said. "I know." He turned his head to look at her in the lamplight coming through the window. "That's why I wanted to help. Not because you couldn't manage without it, because you could, and you still deserved not to have to." She turned that over in her mind, the way she still turned things he said over and found more in them on the second pass. "That is exactly it," she said. "That is exactly the thing I didn't know how to name. That's what I'd never found before. Someone who helped not because they thought I was helpless, but because they simply saw that it was needed and they could provide it, and that was enough of a reason." He squeezed her hand. "My father called it just paying attention," he said. "Your father was a remarkably wise man," she said, not for the first time. "He was a carpenter," Wallace said, with the simplicity of a man for whom that explained everything. A third child came in 1888, another boy, named Henry, who arrived with the same robust opinions as Thomas and the same gray-green eyes. Henry was the child who would spend his whole early life trying to keep up with his older brother and sister and being just fast enough to cause trouble. Wallace caught him on the barn roof at the age of 3.5 and carried him down with more equanimity than Nora felt was entirely warranted. Given that she had aged approximately 5 years in the 5 seconds, she'd looked up from the garden to see her youngest on the barn roof. The livery was fully theirs now, expanded and running well. The cattle operation with Dutch Keller had grown to something that mattered in the region, and Nora was handling the business end of it with a directness and clarity that had eventually won over even Mr. Ferris at the bank, who had stopped barely concealing his skepticism and now greeted her with something approaching genuine respect. In 1889, the Kansas land rushes to the south created a new wave of people coming through Caldwell, and the town grew, and the business grew with it. New faces, new stories, the endless frontier arithmetic of people arriving with nothing and trying to make it into something. Nora saw herself in some of them, particularly the women coming alone or nearly so, navigating the machinery of the territory with less help than they needed. She started in a quiet and entirely practical way, helping where she could. A word to the right person, a pry bar lent, knowledge of which road was passable and which creek crossing to stay left of. She did not make any ceremony of it. She paid attention to what was needed and she responded to it. Wallace noticed. Of course he noticed. He told her one evening, with the directness she had always loved in him, that she had always done that. He said she'd been doing it since before he met her, he suspected. The practical generosity of a person who didn't wait to be asked because they could see what was needed. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about her mother, who had been the same way, moving through life with a steady attention to what the people around her needed, fixing things without fanfare, providing without ledger. She thought about how she'd come to Caldwell with her wagon wheel broken and not a soul on the street stopping, and how Wallace had crossed the road with his rope on his shoulder and his hammer in his hand, and had simply acted on what he saw. She thought about how one small act of uncomplicated attention had changed the entire shape of her life. She thought about Thomas and Ellen and Henry asleep in their beds, and the wheat fields and the cattle and the good well with its strong new pulley, and the south pasture where the meadowlark had been singing for 7 years now, either the same bird or a succession of birds that understood their duty. She thought about Wallace Carver's hands, which were the same hands they'd always been, calloused and sure and gentle. In the fall of 1889, she wrote another long letter to Cora, who was settled comfortably with Robert Hale in their house on the east side of Caldwell, and had two stepchildren who adored her, and a school that ran smoothly under her firm and cheerful management. Nora wrote about the children and the cattle and the harvest, and the new people coming through the territory. She wrote about Wallace, as she still did, the way you keep writing about something that is still a source of wonder even when it has become also simply the ground beneath your feet. She told Cora that she had been thinking about what it was that had undone her in those first weeks, that had made her notice Wallace Carver in the way she had, before she'd even let herself admit that she was noticing him. She wrote, "It was not the grand gestures, it was never the grand gestures. It was the complete absence of the need for one. He crossed the road and fixed the thing because the thing needed fixing and he could fix it. He did not need me to see it or thank him for it or understand its significance. He did not keep accounts. He simply saw what was needed and he responded to it, and I had never in my life encountered that before from a man, that pure and uncomplicated attention, and I did not know until I found it that it was the thing I had been needing." Cora wrote back and said, "I knew when you mentioned fixing things without being asked. I knew right then." Nora laughed reading that, alone at the kitchen table with her coffee, while the children were outside with Wallace in the south pasture, teaching them something. She could hear his voice and their voices and the meadowlark, all of it mixing together in the warm fall morning. She folded the letter and set it in the drawer where she kept Cora's letters, a substantial stack now, years of letters, a record of a life built from scratch in the Kansas territory, from a broken wagon wheel on a main street where no one stopped to this, to 40 acres and a family and a man with gray-green eyes who paid attention. She sat for a moment with her coffee in both hands and felt the completeness of it. Thomas came in at a run to tell her that Papa had shown them a baby rabbit's nest in the grass near the fence line, and could she come see? And she set down her coffee and went out into the fall morning, and Wallace was standing in the pasture with Ellen on his hip and Henry at his feet, and he looked up when Nora came across the yard and he smiled at her, the full one, the one that changed his whole face. She walked across the grass to him, and he shifted Ellen to his other hip and put his free arm around Nora, and she leaned into his shoulder and they stood together and looked at the rabbit's nest that Thomas was pointing at with great authority and Henry was trying to look at from a position that was partly under the fence rail. "He'll be through the fence in a moment," Nora said. "I know," Wallace said, without moving to stop it yet. "Let him figure out it doesn't work." Henry attempted the fence rail gap, found it insufficient, regrouped, and tried a different angle. Ellen commented on this from her position on Wallace's hip with what sounded like informed criticism. Thomas told Henry to just go around, with the world-weariness of a 5-year-old who had seen much. The Kansas morning was bright and clear and wide, the way it got in October, the light that particular clean gold that was different from any other light in any season, and that Nora had come to think of as the specific light of this place, of her home. She stood in her husband's arm on the land she had broken and planted and defended and grown over 7 years, and she thought about the morning she'd driven into Caldwell with $63 and a broken wagon wheel and a rocking chair lashed to the back, and the man who had crossed the road with his hammer in his hand without being asked. All of it had followed from that, from the simple fact of a man who paid attention and responded to what he saw, without ceremony, without ledger, without needing anything from the exchange except the satisfaction of having done the right thing. She turned her face against his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and felt his arm tighten around her in the way it always did when she did that, just slightly, just enough to say, "I see you, I have you, I am here." Henry made it through the fence rail gap on the 4th attempt and emerged on the other side with the expression of a man who has accomplished something remarkable. "I knew he'd manage it eventually," Wallace said. "He gets that from you," Nora said. "The persistence. The complete certainty that if something needs doing, it can be done." He looked down at her with the gray-green eyes that she knew better than any landscape she had ever lived inside, and she saw in them what she had always seen there, the full and steady attention of a man who had loved her from the first moment of clear acknowledgement with everything he had, and had never once made her doubt it. "We should probably get Henry back on the right side of the fence," she said. "We should," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment, standing in the October light with their children arguing amiably around them, and the meadowlark going in the long grass and the cottonwood moving in the morning breeze. This was it. This was the life. Not despite the broken wheel and the difficult road and Garrett Slade's cold eyes and the long winter and all the work that had never once been easy. Because of all of it. Because she had driven into Caldwell with $63 and a broken wheel, and no one had stopped, and then one man had crossed the road with his hammer in his hand, and everything that mattered in the world had followed from that single, uncomplicated act of attention. She had never once encountered that before. She encountered it every day now. She took Wallace's free hand and held it and called out to Henry to come back around to the gate, and the morning opened out before them, warm and bright and entirely, irreversibly theirs.